After my husband's death, his lawyer handed me an envelope. Do not open until 2026. Today is that day. With trembling hands, I opened it. Inside was a photo of my husband taken last week, and a note. I'm alive. I had to fake my death because they wanted to... Good day, dear listeners. It's Louisa again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Margaret Holloway, though everyone who loves me calls me Maggie. I'm 68 years old, and I live in a white clapboard house on Sycamore Lane in Millhaven, Virginia. A town small enough that everybody knows what you had for breakfast, and kind enough that somebody usually brings it to you when you're sick. I had lived in that house for 31 years with my husband Thomas, and I had expected to die in it beside him. Thomas was not a flashy man. He was the kind of man who fixed the porch steps before you even noticed they were loose, who remembered how you took your coffee without ever being told twice. We had met at a church potluck in 1987. I brought deviled eggs. He brought a chess pie that was slightly burnt on the edges. And by the time the evening was over, I knew I was going to marry him. I did. 6 months later. We were not rich. We were comfortable, which is a different and in some ways better thing. Thomas had a daughter from his first marriage, Diane Holloway Crane. She was 41 when Thomas got his diagnosis, and she had never, not once in 23 years, called me anything but Margaret, with a flatness in her voice that made it sound like a mild insult. Her husband, Rick Crane, sold commercial real estate and had the handshake of a man who wanted something from you. I had made my peace with Diane long ago, the way you make peace with a splinter. You stop poking at it and try to forget it's there. The cancer came fast. Pancreatic, stage 3, already threading itself through Thomas like bad news through a small town. The doctors in Richmond gave him 8 to 14 months. He lasted 11. I held his hand when he went, on a Tuesday morning in March, with the dogwood just starting to bloom outside his window. I thought that was the whole story, except now I think about the last 2 months of his life, and I see things I didn't see then. He started locking his study door. Thomas had never locked anything. He grew quieter in ways that I attributed to the morphine. But sometimes, I'd come into a room and catch him looking at me with an expression I couldn't name. Not sadness exactly, more like apology. He made 2 trips to see Stuart Moss, his attorney, without telling me. When I asked, he said it was estate paperwork. I believed him, because why wouldn't I? And there was the matter of Diane's visits. She started coming more frequently in those final weeks, which seemed natural. A daughter wanting time with her dying father. But Thomas never seemed comforted by her presence. He seemed, if anything, more tense when she left. Once, I passed the study door and heard raised voices. Diane's low and insistent, Thomas's tired and resistant. When I knocked and asked if everything was all right, Diane opened the door with a bright, practiced smile and said they were just going over sentimental items. Thomas looked at the wall. I filed these things in the cabinet of grief and forgot them, the way you forget small pains when you are learning to carry a large one. That was 4 years ago. This morning, February 28, 2026, Stuart Moss knocked on my door at 10 o'clock sharp. I had not seen him since the reading of the will. He was carrying a plain manila envelope with my name written across the front in Thomas's handwriting. My husband had been dead for 4 years, and there was his handwriting, as familiar to me as my own face. He asked me to give you this today, Stuart said. He was very specific about the date. I didn't ask questions. I waited until Stuart's car had pulled out of the driveway, and then I sat down at the kitchen table where Thomas and I had eaten 31 years of breakfasts, and I opened the envelope with shaking hands. Inside was a photograph. A man in a gray jacket standing in front of what looked like a train station. Prague, maybe, or Vienna, somewhere with old stone and iron street lamps. The man was thinner, His hair was fully white now, and he had a beard he'd never had before. But it was Thomas. The photograph had a date stamp from the previous week. Beneath it was a folded note written in the same careful print I had known for decades. "I'm alive. I had to fake my death because they were going to hurt you. Diane and Rick have been blackmailing me for years. They know things, Maggie, and they threaten to use them against you. I chose the only way I knew to keep you safe. I am so sorry. If you're reading this, it means I believe it may finally be safe enough to tell you the truth. Don't contact me yet. Don't tell anyone. Burn this after you read it, except the photo. You'll need it. More will come. Trust Stu. I love you." T. I sat at that kitchen table for a long time, listening to the refrigerator hum. My husband was alive, and Diane knew. For a long time, I didn't move. The photograph sat on the table in front of me, and the refrigerator kept humming, and outside, a cardinal landed on the feeder and flew away again. And I thought, this is what a life-altering moment looks like. Not thunder, a cardinal and a humming refrigerator. And I am not a woman given to hysteria. I raised 2 children, buried a mother, survived a house fire in 1998 that took everything on the 2nd floor, and I have a particular stubbornness of temperament that my children politely call resilience, and that Thomas used to call, with affection, pig-headedness. So I did not cry. I picked up the photograph and studied it carefully for a full minute. I catalogued. Thomas's posture, still slightly right-leaning the way it had been since he threw his back out in 2009. The gray jacket. I didn't recognize it, but it was his style, conservative, slightly too large in the shoulders. The scar on his left hand from the table saw 1994, still there. It was him. And then I began to think about what 4 years had actually cost me. I thought about the grief, not as an abstraction, but as a physical inventory. The nights I lay in our bed, unable to sleep, reaching to his side. The first Thanksgiving alone? The Christmas I gave away his clothes because keeping them felt like a shrine, and giving them away felt like betrayal, and there was no right answer. The way I had reorganized my entire remaining life around his absence. Smaller grocery runs, 1 toothbrush, the singular grammar of widowhood. I had grieved him completely. I had finished it. I had, with enormous effort, come out the other side. And he had been alive in Prague or Vienna, or wherever that train station was, the entire time. The anger came then, and it was cold, not hot. The kind that doesn't make you shout, but makes you very still. But here was what Thomas's note told me. He had done this to protect me. Whatever Diane and Rick had been holding over him, he had considered it dangerous enough to die rather than let them use it against me. That was not a small calculation. Thomas was not a dramatic man. He did not exaggerate danger, which meant the danger had been real, which meant it might still be real. I got up and put the kettle on because I needed to do something with my hands. What did I actually know? I knew Thomas was alive and somewhere in Europe. I knew Diane and Rick had been blackmailing him. I knew Stuart Moss was in on it, or at least knew enough to be trusted. I knew Thomas wanted me to wait, to not contact him, to trust Stuart. What did I not know? What the blackmail was about? Whether Diane and Rick still believed Thomas was dead, or whether they knew too. What "more will come" meant. And most urgently, why was 2026 the year? Why this date? I wrote these questions down in the back of a grocery notepad, in small letters, the way I write lists. Then I called Stuart Moss. He answered on the 2nd ring. "Maggie." I read it, I said. "I know." A pause. "He said you'd call within 2 hours." "He was right. I need to see you." I can come to you tomorrow morning, same time? Tonight, I said. Please. He came at 7. We sat in the living room, the same living room where I had received condolence calls 4 years ago, where Diane had sat in the blue armchair and cried just beautifully, just the right amount, the way a person cries when they've practiced. And Stuart told me what he could. Thomas had been laundering nothing, stealing nothing, doing nothing illegal. That was the first thing Stuart needed me to understand. What Diane had found, had Rick dig up through a private investigator hired before the cancer diagnosis, was something from Thomas's past. A period in the late 1980s before me, when Thomas had been briefly involved with a woman who was, it turned out, connected to people under federal investigation. Thomas had known nothing about it. But there were photographs, there were records, and in the hands of someone motivated and unscrupulous, they could be made to look like something they were not. Diane had threatened to send them to a federal contact she claimed Rick had. She had also threatened, and this was what made Thomas's decision, to use them to destroy my reputation. I was, at that time, the director of a small nonprofit literacy program. My name meant something in this town. Thomas knew that if I were publicly connected to a scandal, however manufactured, it would have ended something I loved. So he found another way. With Stuart's help, he had staged the death meticulously: legitimate terminal illness, real hospice care, a closed casket funeral with Stuart managing the paperwork through a set of circumstances. I will not fully detail here, because some of it sat in legal gray areas that I prefer not to examine too closely. He had gone to Europe. He had waited. The plan had always been 2026. Long enough for statutes to shift, for the evidence to become dated, for Thomas to have gathered from his quiet exile the documentation he needed to neutralize Diane and Rick. Stuart told me that Thomas had been building a counterfile, records of the blackmail itself, which is a crime. Financial irregularities in Diane's handling of the small trust she had convinced Thomas to let her co-manage in his final months. What do I need to do? I asked. Stuart placed a second envelope on the coffee table. This one I had not yet seen. Thomas's instructions, step by step. He couldn't be here to help you, Maggie, so he tried to prepare you for everything. I looked at the envelope for a moment. I thought about Thomas sitting somewhere with old stone and iron street lamps, writing instructions for his wife to fight the battle he had started. I picked it up. Thomas's instructions were 12 pages, typed and dated. I read them that night after Stuart left at the kitchen table, with a cup of tea that went cold beside me. He had written them the way he did everything, methodically, without drama. Page 1 was an apology. I read it once, carefully, and then I turned the page because I knew that if I read it again, I would stop being useful to myself. There would be time for the apology later. There would be time for all of it later. Pages 2 through 12 were a plan. Thomas had identified 4 things I would need to do, in sequence, and he had done as much of the preparatory work as he could from abroad. First, I was to contact an attorney named Patricia Vance in Richmond, not Stuart, who was too close to the situation, but Patricia, who specialized in estate fraud and elder financial exploitation. Thomas had already spoken with Patricia by phone the previous year. She was expecting my call. Second, I was to request a formal audit of the small co-managed trust, the Holloway Family Educational Trust, which Diane had convinced Thomas to give her co-signatory authority over in his last months. Third, I was to say nothing to Diane or Rick until Patricia advised me otherwise. And fourth, I was to go to a safe deposit box at First Millhaven Bank, box number 114, for which Stuart would give me the key. I called Patricia Vance the next morning at 9 o'clock. She was direct, unhurried, and asked exactly the right questions, which is the mark of someone who knows their work. By the end of the call, I had an appointment for the following Thursday and a list of documents to gather. She explained that if the trust had been mismanaged, there were both civil and criminal remedies, and that the civil route would begin with a formal accounting demand. It was the first time since reading the envelope that I felt something other than cold shock. What I felt was forward motion. It was also, as it turned out, the moment things began to change for Diane. I didn't know this until later, but Diane had people. She had always had people. A woman in the county assessor's office who was her college roommate. A man at the title company who owed Rick a favor. Small-town surveillance, the informal kind, conducted through coffee shop conversations and parking lot glances. When Patricia Vance's name appeared in a search connected to my phone number, how exactly this happened I still don't fully understand. But Rick Crane was a man who had spent 20 years in commercial real estate and knew how to follow money trails, Diane noticed. She called me on a Thursday afternoon, 3 days after I had read the envelope. "Just checking in, Margaret," she said. Her voice was warm and professional, the way a dentist's receptionist is warm. "I've been thinking about you. We should have dinner." "That would be lovely," I said, which was a lie of such caliber I surprised myself. "Rick mentioned maybe coming by Saturday?" "I'm busy Saturday," I said. "I'll call you soon, Diane." I hung up and stood in my hallway and understood that she knew something was in motion. Not what, not how much, but something. Diane Holloway Crane was a woman who controlled through proximity, through the management of information, through showing up. The invitation to dinner was reconnaissance. The mention of Rick was a reminder that they came as a pair. Good, I thought. Let her wonder. The key to box 114 was exactly where Stuart said it would be. I went to the bank on Friday morning at 10, and I asked the young man at the desk to escort me to the vault with no particular drama. I signed the form. I went in. The box was not large. Inside was a single manila folder, and inside that folder were 43 pages of documentation that Thomas had apparently accumulated and transferred through Stuart over the course of 3 years. I sat in the small private room beside the vault and read every page. The first section was a record of the blackmail itself. Photographs of 3 letters Diane had sent Thomas, scanned copies, with dates. The letters were careful. She had not been stupid enough to put the threat in plain language, but they were clear to anyone who read them in context. "Given your current health situation, I think you'd agree it would be unfortunate for Maggie to be troubled with old complications. I trust we understand each other." 3 letters, spanning 8 months. The second section was a financial record. The Holloway Family Educational Trust had been established with $180,000. According to the statements Thomas had obtained, the balance was now $47,000. The withdrawals had been categorized under administrative fees and investment losses. They were not. I held the folder on my lap in that small bank room and thought about 31 years of breakfast. I thought about Thomas sitting somewhere with white hair and a beard, building this file, waiting for 2026, trusting that I would be capable of using it. The anger I had felt 2 days ago, cold and still, settled into something else now, something that had a purpose. This was not grief anymore. This was evidence. My meeting with Patricia Vance in Richmond took place on a gray Thursday in early March, in an office on the 4th floor of a building that smelled of carpet cleaner and old coffee. Patricia was 53, short, with reading glasses on a chain, and the particular manner of someone who has listened to too many sad stories to waste time on preamble. I laid the folder on her desk and gave her 20 minutes to read. When she looked up, she said, "He built a solid foundation. We can work with this." The formal accounting demand for the Holloway Family Educational Trust was filed the following Tuesday. It was a civil document, unremarkable in legal terms, a standard instrument. But it required Diane to produce, within 30 days, a complete accounting of every transaction the trust had made since its establishment. It arrived at her attorney's address by certified mail. She called me that same evening. This time, the warmth was gone. "What are you doing, Margaret?" Not a greeting, just the question, landing flat. "I'm exercising my rights as an interested party to the trust," I said. I had practiced this sentence with Patricia. "You have no idea what you're doing." A pause. "We should talk in person." "My attorney will be in touch with yours." I hung up. They came 2 days later, Saturday morning, unannounced. Rick's black SUV in my driveway at 8:45 a.m. I saw it from the kitchen window and felt my heart do something unpleasant, but I put down my coffee cup and walked to the door. Rick Crane was a large man, wide through the shoulders with a face built for authority, all jaw and forward lean. He stood slightly ahead of Diane on my porch, which told me everything about how they'd decided to approach this. Diane stood behind him with her arms crossed and her face arranged into something approximating concern. "Maggie," Rick said, using my name for the first time in 23 years. "We need to talk." I did not invite them in. I stood in the doorway. "We understand you've made some kind of request through an attorney," he said. "We think there may be a miscommunication." "There isn't," I said. Rick's expression shifted. "You need to understand something." His voice dropped, and it was no longer the voice he used at dinner parties. "You are an old woman living alone, and there are a lot of things that can get complicated for a person in that situation. Financial things, estate things, health things." He said the word health the way you say it when you mean something else entirely. I looked at him for a moment, and then I looked at Diane. "Are you threatening me?" I said. Diane's arms tightened across her chest. "No one is threatening anyone, Margaret. We're just concerned. You've obviously been through a hard time, and sometimes grief can make people—" "Diane." I said her name simply, like a period at the end of a sentence. "I have an attorney. Her name is Patricia Vance. Her number is on record with your attorney. If you have anything to say to me about the trust, you can say it through her." I paused. "And if either of you come to my house again unannounced, I will call the police." I closed the door. I stood in my hallway and listened to the sound of their footsteps on the porch, and then Rick's voice saying something low and sharp that I couldn't fully hear, and then the SUV starting, and then gravel under tires, and then quiet. My hands were shaking. I let them shake. Rick Crane's parting gesture, and I only saw it because I watched from the front window, was to stand by his car and look at my house for a long, deliberate moment before getting in. It was the kind of look that was meant to be seen. It was a message. We're not done. I understood the message. I also understood that I had not moved. I had opened the door, I had spoken, and I had closed it again. I was 68 years old, and I had stood in my own doorway, and I had not moved. Patricia had advised me, early in our work together, that there would likely be a moment of pressure, and that how I responded to it would shape everything that followed. "They need you to feel like you're alone," she told me. "The moment they believe that's true, they'll escalate. The moment they believe it's not true, they'll recalibrate." I took my attorney's advice and allowed myself 4 days of something that was not quite rest, but was a conscious step away from forward motion. I went to church on Sunday. I had lunch with my neighbor Frances, who was 70 and funny, and who asked no questions I didn't want to answer. I read a novel I'd been neglecting. I called my son David in Portland and told him I missed him, which was true, even if I couldn't tell him why I was feeling it so acutely just then. By Wednesday, I was ready again. On Wednesday morning, I called Patricia and told her I was ready to proceed. She had been waiting. The 30-day accounting period had begun its clock. In the meantime, she had quietly contacted a forensic accountant she worked with regularly, a man named Bernard Cole, who had agreed to review the trust documents when the accounting was produced. Patricia expected it would be incomplete or falsified. She had seen it before. I had begun to understand that this situation had a rhythm to it, not unlike grief in a strange way. It moved in phases, and the ones that felt like stillness were not stillness at all, but preparation. On Thursday, a flower arrangement arrived at my door. White lilies and pale roses from a florist in Richmond I didn't know. The card said, "Thinking of you. We hope we can put this unpleasantness behind us. Family is everything. Diane and Rick." I set the flowers on the kitchen table and looked at them for a moment. They were beautiful, objectively. Whoever had arranged them had taste. I thought about what they were designed to make me feel: softened, guilty, uncertain, perhaps a little lonely, perhaps willing to pick up the phone and call Diane and say, "You're right, family is everything. Let's forget it." I put the flowers in the trash, not because I am a hard woman. I put them in the trash because I had 43 pages in a folder at Patricia Vance's office that told me exactly what Diane's definition of family was. I called Patricia to let her know about the gesture. She said, "Good. It means they're nervous." She advised me to document it, photograph the arrangement, keep the card. I did. What I had been turning over in my mind, through those 4 days of rest, and now into this new week, was a question of witness. Thomas's note had told me not to contact him. Patricia had told me not to speak to Diane and Rick directly, and I had been very obedient about both instructions, but I was beginning to understand that I could not carry this entirely alone, and that isolation, apart from being psychologically brutal, was itself a vulnerability. Diane and Rick wanted me isolated. They had perhaps always counted on it. I thought about who in my life I actually trusted. Frances Beaumont next door was kind and discreet, but she was not built for the kind of thing I was navigating. My son David would have flown from Portland immediately, which was precisely why I hadn't told him yet. I wanted to bring him the facts in order, when I had something closer to resolution, not as a reason for him to arrive and do something that couldn't be undone. But there was someone else. Her name was Ruth Ann Pickett. We had been in the same church choir for 14 years. Before that, she had spent 22 years as a social worker in family services, and she had the particular quality of people who have spent decades dealing with the worst of what families do to each other. She was completely unsurprisable, and she never, under any circumstances, repeated what was told to her in confidence. I called Ruth Ann on Thursday afternoon. "I need to tell you something," I said, "and I need you to just listen until I'm done." "Sit down and start from the beginning," she said. I sat down and started from the beginning. She listened for 45 minutes without interrupting once. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "How are you sleeping?" "Badly," I said. "That's honest." Another pause. "Maggie, what you're doing is right, and I want you to know that I'm here, not to help you fight, that's what Patricia's for, but to make sure you eat dinner and don't get so far inside your own head that you lose the thread. Can I come over Friday?" "Please," I said. She came Friday evening and brought a casserole, and we sat in the kitchen, and she let me talk, and she didn't offer false comfort or easy reassurances, which was exactly what I needed. What she offered instead was steadiness, the sense that another person knew what I was navigating, that I was not a woman alone with an extraordinary secret, that if I stumbled, there was someone near enough to say, "Get up, Maggie. You're not done." It is a particular comfort that I had not known I was missing until I had it again. When she left that night, I stood at the door and watched her car pull down Sycamore Lane, and I thought about isolation, about how Diane and Rick had counted on it, about how Thomas's plan had, perhaps inevitably, required me to be alone with it for some time, but had not required me to be alone forever. I had an attorney. I had a plan. I had Patricia and Stuart and Bernard, the forensic accountant, and now I had Ruth Ann on Friday evenings with a casserole. Diane Holloway Crane had flowers in a trash can. They came on a Tuesday, 3 weeks into the accounting period, 12 days after the flowers. This time, Diane called ahead. A courtesy that was its own kind of warning. She said she wanted to bring me lunch, that she'd been worried, that she thought they'd all gotten off on the wrong foot. Her voice was calibrated to the perfect register of wounded concern. I said they could come. Patricia had advised me that refusing all contact could be used against me later. The narrative of an unreasonable, paranoid woman, which was exactly the narrative Diane would be constructing for anyone who might listen. Better to let them come, stay calm, document everything I could recall afterward. I spent the morning before their arrival writing down everything I remembered from our last encounter, every word, in the grocery notepad. Patricia had told me documentation was armor. I was beginning to understand what she meant. They arrived at noon. Diane carried a bag from a French bistro in Richmond. Chicken salad sandwiches, a fruit cup, sparkling water. Rick carried nothing, which meant he was there to look large and be present. They came into my kitchen because I did not offer the living room, and we sat at the table where I had read Thomas's letter. Diane arranged the food with care. She asked about my health. She mentioned that she'd been thinking about Thomas a lot lately. His anniversary was coming, she said, which wasn't quite true. The anniversary was in March, and it was now the second week of April, but I let it pass. She talked about what Thomas would have wanted, which is a phrase that I have noticed is used most often by people who want something for themselves. He would have hated this, she said, all this legal business. You know how much he valued peace in the family. He valued honesty, I said. He was very specific about that. Rick shifted in his chair. Maggie, the trust accounting is going to be a mess to go through. It's going to take time, it's going to cost money, it's going to drag everything back up for you. We'd like to propose a resolution. What kind of resolution? He reached into his jacket and placed a single sheet of paper on the table, a typed agreement. I did not touch it. We'd like to return some of the administrative fees that may have been, let's say, less clearly documented than they should have been. He said it smoothly, like a man who'd practiced. 20,000 in good faith, in exchange for withdrawing the accounting request and the legal action. I looked at the paper. Then I looked at Rick. Then I looked at Diane, who was watching me with her hands folded and her expression composed into something I might have mistaken years ago for genuine care. 20,000, I thought, out of $133,000 missing. You'd like me to accept $20,000, I said, and close the matter. It would spare everyone a great deal of difficulty, Diane said. She leaned forward slightly. Margaret, you're 68 years old. Do you really want to spend the next year of your life in courtrooms? Think about what that does to a person. The stress, the exposure. She softened her voice to something almost tender. I'm worried about you. Honestly. You've been alone for 4 years. You've been through so much loss. And lately, and I say this with love, some of the decisions you're making concern me. There it was. Not a threat, a suggestion. The suggestion that perhaps my grief had compromised my judgment. Perhaps I was not entirely well. Perhaps my insistence on pursuing this legal matter was evidence of a mind not quite at its most reliable. It was elegantly done, I'll give her that. She hadn't said anything that could be quoted back to her as an accusation. She'd said it with her eyes soft and her voice low, the way a person talks to someone they're genuinely worried about. It was almost convincing. Almost. Who have you said that to? I asked. That you're concerned about me? She blinked. I mentioned it to our family doctor. I see, I said. I understood, with complete clarity, what was being laid. If I became difficult enough, if I pressed hard enough, there would be a quiet word here, a concerned family member's inquiry there, and the story of my mental deterioration would be ready to deploy when needed. A grieving widow, acting erratically, perhaps not quite managing on her own. It was a contingency plan, a weapon held in reserve, and she had just let me see it, deliberately, so that I would know it was there. Was I supposed to be frightened? I was, but I was also something else. Diane, I said, I'm going to ask you to leave now. Rick straightened. Maggie, I've listened to what you came to say. I appreciate the lunch. I stood up slowly, the way a woman who has no intention of being rushed stands up. My answer is no. My attorney will continue to proceed. I pushed the settlement offer across the table toward him, careful not to leave my fingerprints on it from this point on, as Patricia had instructed. Please take this with you. Diane's face changed. It was a small change, controlled, but I had been watching her for 23 years and I knew what was underneath it. Not hurt, not frustration, but fury. Cold and absolute fury, the kind that had been a long time building and that had very little to do with the trust or the money, and everything to do with the discovery that I was not, in fact, the woman she had always taken me to be. Rick stood up slowly. He buttoned his jacket, which struck me as an odd gesture, performative, the kind of thing a man does when he wants a moment to compose himself without appearing to need one. You're making a mistake, he said. And this time there was nothing diplomatic in his voice at all. You're making a mistake and you're doing it alone, and you should think very carefully about that. Thank you for coming, I said. I walked them to the door. I held it open. They went through it. I locked it after them, walked to the kitchen window, and watched the SUV back down the driveway. Diane didn't look at the house this time. She stared straight ahead, and her profile had the stillness of someone recalculating. Rick paused at the car door before getting in and looked at the house the same long, deliberate way he had before. It was the same message. We're not done. And here is what I thought, watching him. Neither am I. I sat down at the table. My hands were shaking again, and I let them. The fear was real, and I did not pretend otherwise. Rick Crane's quiet threat, Diane's mention of the family doctor, the settlement offer that was an insult dressed as generosity. These were not nothing. These were the actions of people who were accustomed to winning through pressure and who had not yet encountered the thing that would stop them. But fear, I had learned in 4 years of widowhood, is not the opposite of courage. It is simply what courage has to work with. I picked up my phone and called Patricia. They made a settlement offer, I said. Verbal, plus a document I didn't touch. $20,000. And Diane implied she's been talking to their family doctor about my mental fitness. Patricia's silence lasted exactly 2 seconds. Don't touch the food they brought. I looked at the sandwiches still on the table. I didn't eat anything, I said. Good. Document everything from the visit, every word you can remember. Write it down tonight while it's fresh. Date it, sign it, photograph the page. A brief pause. And Maggie, we're ready to move faster than I initially planned. I'll explain Thursday. Can you come to Richmond? Yes, I said. Good. Her voice was steady as a hand on a railing. You did well today. I set the phone down. Outside the window, the SUV was gone, and Sycamore Lane was quiet and ordinary again, as if none of it had happened here. But it had, and I knew something now that I hadn't known before they'd walked through my door. They were afraid of me. Not as much as I needed them to be, but enough to show me their contingency plan, which meant they weren't certain their primary plan would hold. Uncertain people make mistakes. I got up, put the untouched sandwiches in the trash beside the lilies, and went to find my grocery notepad. The meeting was scheduled for a Thursday in Patricia's conference room in Richmond at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Patricia had done something I had not expected. Rather than wait for the 30-day accounting period to expire and then respond to whatever Diane's team produced, she had used the 2-week intervening period to file an emergency motion in the circuit court. A petition for immediate independent receivership of the trust, based on the evidence of financial irregularities already in hand. She had also, through careful procedural channels, filed a complaint with the Commonwealth's Attorney's Office regarding the blackmail letters. The letters were not sufficient for criminal charges on their own, but they were sufficient to open a file, and an open file changes the atmosphere of a civil proceeding considerably. Diane's attorney had objected to the emergency motion. The judge had overruled. The Thursday meeting was the result. A court-ordered accounting conference with Bernard Cole present as the independent financial examiner. Stuart Moss came. He sat beside me and said very little, which was his way of saying he was there. Diane and Rick arrived with 2 attorneys. Rick wore a suit I'd never seen, dark navy, the kind that was meant to signal substance. Diane wore gray and looked, for the first time in 23 years, slightly diminished by something she had not chosen. Bernard Cole spread the trust documents on the table. He had the manner of a man describing a plumbing problem. Precise, affectless, relentless. He went through each withdrawal. Administrative fees billed to a company that, when traced, incorporated to an address that was, ultimately, a mailbox service registered to a shell entity in which Rick Crane was a named officer. Investment losses that corresponded to no actual investment accounts on record. It took him 40 minutes. Diane's lead attorney tried to interrupt twice. Bernard continued speaking. When Bernard finished, Patricia placed the 3 blackmail letters on the table, the scanned originals, authenticated. These letters, she said, document a pattern of coercion directed at Thomas Holloway during the period in which the trust was established and during which your client was granted co-signatory authority. We believe the timeline is not coincidental. Diane's attorney said, "My client has no knowledge of..." "The 3rd letter," Patricia said calmly, "was sent from a personal email address registered to Diane Holloway Crane. We have the metadata." Silence. I watched Diane. She was looking at the letters with an expression that was doing a great deal of work, trying to remain blank, trying to remain professional, but something was failing at its edges. Her jaw was tight. Rick had stopped looking at anyone and was studying the table. "I want to address," Patricia continued, "the question of whether these transactions were the result of negligence or of deliberate exploitation." She paused. "They were deliberate. Bernard." Bernard produced a timeline chart. The withdrawals had accelerated in the months following Thomas's diagnosis, when he was weakest, when he was in pain, when he was managing a secret that I now knew the full shape of. They had robbed a dying man, or a man they believed was dying. Rick Crane broke first. He leaned toward his attorney and said something low and sharp, and his attorney put a hand on his arm, and Rick shook it off. "This is not. You cannot sit here and imply..." "Mr. Crane," Patricia said, "you are free to respond to the court's accountant. I would encourage you to do so carefully." "You have no idea," Rick said. His voice had lost its professional register completely. "You have no idea what Thomas was..." "Rick!" Diane said it sharply, a command. He stopped, but the moment had happened, and everyone in the room had seen it. I had said nothing through the entire presentation. I had agreed with Patricia that silence would be more powerful than statement, that I was there as a witness to the accounting, not as a combatant. But I had watched Diane across that table for 2 hours, and I had watched the moment she understood that she had miscalculated. She had believed I was a grieving old woman, malleable and alone, and afraid of paperwork. She had believed that the management of Thomas's death gave her the superior position, the full story, the leverage. She had not imagined that Thomas had been building this case for 3 years from a city with old stone and iron street lamps. She had not imagined that he had prepared me for exactly this room. When the meeting ended, no resolution reached, further proceedings scheduled. Diane and I were briefly proximate in the corridor. Her attorneys were ahead of her, talking. Rick was behind. She stopped. "He told you everything," she said. It wasn't a question. I looked at her. "Your father was a good man," I said. "You should have left him alone." I walked past her to the elevator. The proceedings moved quickly after Thursday's conference. The Commonwealth's attorney's office had enough to proceed, and they did. The blackmail complaint became an indictment, 2 counts of criminal coercion, 1 count of extortion. The authenticity of the email metadata was confirmed by the court's digital forensics examiner. The 3 letters, read in the context of the trust timeline, were damning. Diane's attorneys negotiated. They negotiated for 6 weeks and achieved very little. The civil case concluded first. The independent receiver appointed by the circuit court conducted a full audit of the Holloway Family Educational Trust. Bernard Cole's preliminary findings were confirmed and expanded. Of the $133,000 that had been removed from the trust, $118,000 was recovered through the forced liquidation of the shell entity Rick had used. He had not been particularly sophisticated, only brazen, which is often worse, and through a judgment against Diane personally. The remaining $15,000 was categorized as unrecoverable through practical means, and Patricia advised me to accept that as the cost of dealing with people who had spent years learning where to hide things. I accepted it. The criminal proceedings concluded 3 months after that. Diane pleaded no contest to 1 count of criminal coercion and accepted a negotiated sentence. 3 years probation, community service, a fine, and a formal bar from serving in any fiduciary or trust management capacity in the Commonwealth of Virginia. Rick, who had been the financial architect, received a stiffer negotiation. He pleaded guilty to 1 count of extortion and received 18 months of suspended sentence with conditions, a larger fine, and the effective end of his real estate licensing. Stuart Moss had been quietly managing a parallel matter the entire time. In Europe, in Salzburg as it turned out, not Prague, not Vienna, though the train station in the photograph was in Vienna, where Thomas had stopped briefly. Thomas had been preparing documentation for his return. The original staging of his death had involved legal gray areas, as Stuart had said, but Thomas had spent 3 years working with a quiet network of legal professionals to untangle those gray areas into something navigable. A legal framework for the recognition that Thomas Holloway was alive, which required, among other things, a filing in the probate court to vacate the death certificate, an affidavit from Stuart about the circumstances, and a medical certification that the original diagnosis and prognosis had been real, and that the subsequent falsification of records had been undertaken under documented duress. It was a difficult, expensive, and unprecedented process. It was also ultimately successful. On the afternoon of June 14th, a Saturday, warm, the kind of afternoon that in Millhaven smells like cut grass and someone's grill, I parked my car at the Richmond airport and walked to the arrivals level and stood by the doors. I had bought a new blouse, periwinkle blue, which Thomas had always said was my color. Ruth Ann had insisted on driving me, and she sat on a bench 20 feet back because she understood correctly that some moments need a little space around them. The doors opened. Travelers came through, business travelers, families, a group of students with backpacks, and then Thomas. He was thinner. His hair was white, fully white, no gray left, and the beard was there. Shorter now than in the photograph, tidier. He walked with the same slightly right-leaning posture. He was carrying a single bag, olive green, over one shoulder. He stopped when he saw me. He stood very still for a moment, as if he didn't trust the reality of it. I walked toward him. What I felt was not the surging, dramatic rush of a reunion in a film. What I felt was much simpler. The sensation of something that had been missing from the world clicking back into place, the way a window latches when it finally catches correctly after years of being stuck. "You burned the letter," he said. "I kept the photograph," I said. He put his arm around me and I put my face against the shoulder of his jacket, and he said very quietly, "I'm sorry, Maggie. I'm so sorry." "Stop," I said not unkindly. "Take me home." On the way back to Millhaven, we passed through the gold and green of early summer Virginia, and I held his hand, and he told me pieces of Salzburg, and I told him pieces of Patricia's conference room, and somewhere around the exit for Charlottesville, I thought, we are going to have time to tell each other everything. That was the victory. Not the money recovered, not the sentencing, not the look on Diane's face in the corridor, though I am not too dignified to admit that the last of these gave me something. Number. The victory was Thomas's hand in mine at the exit for Charlottesville, with the dogwood behind us and Millhaven ahead. We did not return to the house on Sycamore Lane as if the last 4 years had not happened. We returned to it and allowed it to be different, which is not the same thing. Thomas had missed winters he couldn't be present for. I had reorganized the closets. The spare bedroom had become my reading room, and I told him it was staying that way, and he said that was fine, and we laughed about it, which was the first time I had laughed that way in 4 years without something false in it. The legal recognition of Thomas's existence, a sentence that I would not have predicted needing to use at 68 years old, was complete by late summer. His accounts, his identity documents, his Social Security record, all reinstated through a process that Stuart supervised with the patience of someone who understood he owed us this. Thomas applied quietly for reinstatement on 2 financial accounts that had been transferred through the estate. His medical coverage was a significant logistical challenge. Patricia helped. By September, it was resolved. What we had lost, we understood we could not recover in full. 4 years of ordinary life together. The accumulation of unremarkable evenings that are, in retrospect, what a life is mostly made of. I told Thomas about the first Thanksgiving, and he listened without flinching, and we sat together for a while without speaking, and that was enough. We took a trip in October to the Virginia coast, nothing grand. A rented cottage for a week. We walked on the beach in the mornings and read in the afternoons and ate at a crab place that Thomas found on his 3rd attempt with the navigation app on a new phone. He had returned to the world without a smartphone, and the learning curve was, I confess, a source of some entertainment for me. David flew in from Portland in November, and I told him the full story over 2 evenings. He did not take it easily. There was anger. There was grief. There was a long phone call he needed to make in private. But he was a reasonable man, and by the end of the 2nd evening, he and Thomas were on the couch, watching a football game with a bowl of pretzels between them, and I stood in the kitchen doorway and thought, there it is. Millhaven accepted Thomas's return with the particular quality of small-town grace that processes extraordinary events by not making an extraordinary fuss about them. The story was known. How much of it I can't say exactly. Stuart had been discreet, and I had been more so. But people said welcome back and meant it, and the reverend at our church said a quiet, specific prayer of thanksgiving one Sunday that made half the congregation cry without quite knowing why. I returned to the literacy program. I had stepped back during the worst of the legal period. Now I returned as a volunteer rather than director, which suited me. The new director was a young woman named Carolyn who had good instincts and too much paperwork, and was grateful for an extra pair of experienced hands. As for Diane and Rick, I know what happened to them because Millhaven is a small town, and because Patricia kept me informed as a matter of professional courtesy, and because some of it was public record. Rick's real estate licensing was conditionally suspended pending review by the Virginia Real Estate Board. And when the criminal plea entered the record, The review produced the result anyone paying attention would have expected. He spent 8 months attempting to reestablish in a neighboring state before abandoning the effort. He took a position in logistics management for a mid-size company that, by all accounts, he found humiliating, and that did not pay particularly well. He and Diane relocated to a smaller house in Northern Virginia. The move was not voluntary. Diane's probation required regular check-ins, community service hours, and the financial hit from the civil judgment was significant. She had, as best I could determine, no professional or public life to speak of for quite some time. The bar from fiduciary roles was, given that she had fashioned herself as a manager of other people's affairs, effectively the removal of the tool she'd always used. I did not feel satisfaction about this exactly. Satisfaction implies that I spent time thinking about it, which I did not. What I felt on the ordinary Tuesdays and Fridays of that first year back was something I had not had in a long time and had stopped expecting to have again. The plain, uncelebrated texture of a life that was working. Thomas made chess pie again in November. Properly this time, not burnt. And we ate it at the kitchen table, and he told me about Salzburg winters, and I told him about Ruth Ann's casseroles. And the refrigerator hummed, and the cardinal came to the feeder outside the window, and this time stayed long enough for me to point it out. "Still coming to your yard," Thomas said. "It's our yard," I said. There is a particular kind of strength that looks, from the outside, like an old woman sitting quietly at a kitchen table. Don't be fooled by that. I learned this. Grief can be weaponized, but it can also be survived. Isolation is a tool others use against you. Community is the answer to it. And the truth, however long it has been sealed in an envelope, has a way of arriving exactly when it was intended to. What would you have done if you opened that envelope? If this story moved you, I'd love to know. Leave a comment below. And thank you, truly, for listening.